Good morning, everyone. Much smaller group today. So today we're going to be wrapping up chapter 8. So we had started by talking about, we were looking at emotions and the different parts of the brain that are involved in different types of emotions. And then we're doing sort of an abrupt change where we're going to start talking about stress and sort of how stress might be adaptive or non-adaptive depending on the situation. So, of course, we start with our definition. What is stress? And stress is another one of those things that has two ways that it can be applied. The first is that we can refer to stress as some kind of condition in the environment that makes unusual demands on an organism. So things like threat or failure or even bereavement, those can be stressors. But stress is also going to be used to refer to the response that a body makes in response to those stressful situations. So it's both the situations that cause stress and the stress caused by those situations. Just in case there's some weird wording, it's because of those two different uses. Oh, too far. There we go. And so we're going to start by talking about why stress is something that exists. Why is it something that evolved to occur? And that's because it's an adaptive response. So if we think about any other kind of adaptation, it's something that has evolved to serve some purpose. So short-term stress can actually be fairly beneficial. So what we have in our short-term stress response is mostly going to involve our hypothalamus, and we're going to look at the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis on the next slide. But our base introduction here just says that our hypothalamus is going to stimulate our adrenal medulla, and that's going to release two of our short-acting or fast-acting chemicals here. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are both released, and they're going to increase output from the heart and end up liberating some of the glucose from our muscles for additional energy. So if we think back to the chapter where we were talking about digestion, we were storing away glucose for use later. But if we think about it, if we're stressed, if we're going to enter into that fight or flight response, we're going to want to have as much freely accessible energy as possible. So having these neurotransmitters these hormones releasing sort of larger amounts of glucose is going to be a good thing. So that's our short-acting pathway. We also have a longer-term actor here, and this is cortisol. And this is going to increase metabolism, glucose availability, and blood supply specifically to our skeletal muscles. So it's making sure that we're prepared for that fight or flight response. But cortisol takes a little bit longer to kick in, and is going to be active for quite a bit longer than epinephrine and norepinephrine. So it's almost like we have a short-term response and then a slightly longer-term response. So when we start looking at studies of things like chronic stress, so long-term stresses, most of them are going to be dealing with cortisol because epinephrine and norepinephrine are only used for these immediate responses. All right. And so if we wanted to go into a little bit more detail about this process, most things dealing with stress are going to focus in on this hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And so we're going to be hopping back and forth between slides here because we have a visual for those who like to see things connecting visually, but then we also have the words. And so we're going to be focusing in on our hypothalamus and then our adrenal gland, which is located over near our kidneys, and what else is going on in here. And then also you can see the different lines of different colors are telling us things about which neurotransmitters, which hormones, which substances are involved in which places. There we go. So our first step is having the hypothalamus release something called corticoreptin releasing hormone, or CRH, which is going to send a signal. And again, if we go back over here, so we go from our hypothalamus with CRH heading down here, and it's going to go to the pituitary gland and stimulate the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. So it's sending a signal to tell it to send a signal. And then ATC or ACTH is going to head to our adrenal cortex, and that's what triggers the release of our cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine. So both short-term and long-term stress responses. The really cool part here is that this is kind of like a feedback loop where as these hormones are released, that's also going to trigger stress reducing responses from other target organs. So it's basically saying we're stressed right now, do what you can to make it less stressful. So it's telling the body to try and calm itself down as much as it can. And so that's going to decrease the subsequent release of hormones in that pathway. And again, for the shorter term, it's mostly going to be focusing in on epinephrine and norepinephrine. So once we have a short-term stress response, our body is set up to tell us to stop having a short-term stress response because it is maladaptive to stay in that heightened stress response for too long. Especially if we look at some of the things that this is going to cause, things like, actually I had it on the previous slide, because we mentioned our fight or flight response, and we've talked about this before, where it slows your digestion, it's going to reduce sexual arousal and other things that are not useful while you're trying to survive. And then it's also going to increase your heart rate and your blood pressure and your respiration rate and all of those things that help you survive in the chance of an attack. So having those ongoing indefinitely is not helpful. So these are all of the important players in this axis. And again, the visuals for that. All right. And so the next thing we want to talk about is, okay, so that's the basic stress response, but what does that have to do with the rest of our body? So we're going to start moving on again into the idea of how our immune system responds to stress. And so we have a couple of different types of cells that we're going to be talking about. Two types in particular. So we're going to look at our leukocytes, or our white blood cells. And then we're also going to be looking at natural killer cells, which are a separate category. But all of the ones up on this slide are leukocytes, so white blood cells, and these guys work by recognizing invaders that have unique proteins called antigens on the surface of their cells. So basically, foreign cells coming into the body will have antigens that the body recognizes as foreign, something that shouldn't be there. And so we have different kinds of leukocytes. We can have macrophages. Those are going to basically engulf those invader cells. And what they actually do is pick up those antigens from the cell that they have ingested and display those foreign antigens, basically showing the body that something was here that should not have been. And so that's going to attract our T cells and our B cells. So the T cells are attracted by those particular antigens. They're going to come in. The B cells are going to produce antibodies that attack a particular cell type. So they're going to come in and attack things that are displaying those weird antigens. And that's sort of our immediate body response. And so brief stress is going to lead to a short-term increase in our immune system. So if you think about it again, adaptively, if you're in fight or flight, you might be engaging in fighting or fleeing, which could lead to injury. So it kind of makes sense that your body is ready to deal with short-term injuries. Maybe they want to make sure that if you get a cut, it doesn't get infected, that nothing foreign is getting into your body and sort of wearing you down. So it seems very highly adaptive to help prevent you from getting infections from the result of some kind of threatening situation. Okay, and then our other type of cells, so these are separate, are natural killer cells. So these are separate from our white blood cells, and they're going to still attack and destroy things, but this time they're focusing more on cancerous cells and cells that have been infected with viruses. So this is focusing on the body's own cells that have been sort of modified and are functioning incorrectly in some way. So whereas our white blood cells focus on external cells that have come into the body, natural killer cells focus on what's already in the body but not functioning properly. And these are a lot less specific in their targets than either of our T or B cells. And all this means is they're not hunting for a specific antigen or anything like that. They're just looking for cells that are functioning abnormally. And that can be beneficial because maybe you're encountering a type of virus you've never seen before. These are still going to work. And we have a note here that our central nervous system is mostly protected from a lot of these foreign cells coming into the body because we have, again, our blood-brain barrier. So any kind of infectious agent, anything coming into the body, especially through the blood, is going to be prevented from reaching our brain directly. And we do have microglia, and they're going to basically be like the macrophages, but they're only going to work in the brain, focusing on stuff that gets through that blood-brain barrier. So anything that gets past the natural defenses would be taken care of by our microglia. And because that's quite a few new concepts, we have another one of those nice summary tables from the textbook, and it just lists the 5 types of cells that we've just been talking about. So just a very brief summary of what they each do, just so that you have that for reference. Okay, and so far we've talked and treated this as, okay, stress is a positive thing. Stress gets our body ready to deal with stressful situations. It increases our immune system short term. It seems like a good thing. But stress also has negative side effects. And we probably all know this. As students, you definitely experience prolonged periods of stress, and you start feeling some of those side effects. So we can see things like memory interference and appetite changes, reduced sex drive, depleted energy, disrupted mood, compromised immune system, and worsening concentration. So all of these are things that are actually coming from basically being in that heightened state of arousal, ready for fight or flight, for so long that your body starts running out of resources. So if we think about it, your stress response is to increase your heart rate, get your breathing going, liberate glucose, and get you ready to deal with things. But if you're not actually dealing with the situation and then going back to normal, you're staying in that state where you're burning a lot of resources, your heart is beating too quickly, you're putting a lot of stress on your body, and it leads to quite a few negative outcomes. So things like changes in appetite and sex drive would come from the fact that our response is to suppress appetite and sex drive. So that makes sense that it would change. Memory and things like that would be they're less important when you're in a fight or flight situation. You don't care about storing away information properly while you're fighting for your life, so it can interfere with stuff that way. And eventually, with your immune system, once it's been on high alert for a little while, it's going to run out of resources. It can't maintain that stress response indefinitely. So again, all of this is basically coming from our body being in that stressed state for too long. So longer term stress is usually a bad thing. And these were just a couple of interesting figures from the text that I found. And so they were saying that if we look at our psychological stress index, which is just a standardized test that measures how stressed individuals are, the higher you score on that stress index, the more likely you are to also get sick. So you might have found that whenever you're really, really busy at school, you tend to get a cold or something like that. And it's because your body is run down and your immune system isn't functioning as well. So that kind of makes sense. There's also another one that was looking at number of cardiac deaths on the day of an earthquake. So they were seeing if a large threatening event causing high stress correlated with cardiac events. And it's pretty clear which day had the earthquake by looking at the chart there. So a significant increase on that single day with a very stressful event. And that kind of makes sense because sudden cardiac death is actually one of those specially named terms that fits in with a negative stress response. So if we have this excessive sympathetic activity, so because of stress, having our sympathetic nervous system activated for too long can actually send the heart into fibrillation. Basically where it's beating not at the right pace. And so it'll beat so fast that it doesn't actually end up pumping your blood. So it can cause sudden cardiac death. And so they see that this increases quite a bit as your stress levels increase as well. All right. And then continuing with the negative responses from the body in reaction to stress, if we have chronic stress, which again is those longer term stressors, we can actually start seeing structural and functional changes in the brain. So most of the studies that have looked at this have been in non-human animals. So for example, on the slide, there's the sort of a slice of a hippocampus in a, what kind of monkey? They don't say what kind of monkey. In a monkey. So they were looking at how does the brain change as they're exposed to prolonged periods of stress. And we actually end up seeing damage to the hippocampus, which is part of that hippocampus axis. So that kind of makes sense. When it's being used too much, it might start to degenerate. And there's lots of ongoing studies looking at sort of how our body changes with exposure to stress. But as we're going to find out, and as we're going to keep saying, when we're looking at any of these factors with human subjects, we have to be very careful about how this is done. From our discussion of ethics, you know that you can't put people in stressful situations to see how quickly their health declines. That isn't ethical. So most of this research, especially in human subjects, is going to be looking at correlational results. So even though we can say that there is a link between two things, we still want to be careful about inferring causal relationships because correlational studies really don't give us those. So I'll keep mentioning that as we look at some different kinds of data, especially as we move on into our next topic, which is, there we go, social, personality, and genetic factors. And it seems kind of weird to cluster these all together until we remember that a lot of things are all interrelated. So we've talked about personality being something that is heritable. There is some sort of genetic link to your personality. And that makes sense, and your personality will affect your social interactions and things like that. Hence, all three of these topics being very interconnected. But this is where that correlational study awareness is really important. And that's because they've found associations between personality traits and either vulnerability to or protection against disease. But the way that this is stated, having vulnerability to or protection against almost implies like having a particular trait makes you develop a particular disease, or having a particular trait prevents you from getting a disease. But again, we're not implying directionality here. We're just looking at co-occurrence. So the first is this type D or distressed personality that is linked to increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So people who fall under this particular category of personality, they also tend to develop cardiovascular disease. And because of what we've just talked about with stress and being closely linked with cardiovascular problems, it kind of makes sense. So it's like, okay, so if these people are easily distressed, They are going to maybe internalize a lot of the bad things they encounter in their lives. Maybe if they're easily going to give up in a situation, that could put them at higher risk of being affected by stress, and then long-term causing damage to their cardiovascular system. There's also another really interesting study that was looking at individuals infected with HIV. And if they compared personality traits, specifically the introversion-extroversion spectrum, they found that individuals who scored higher on introversion and also had HIV could have as high as 8 times the viral load of those who scored higher on sort of the extroversion, the other end of the scale. So people who were more withdrawn and less sociable would score sort of having much, much higher viral loads, which I thought was very interesting. And then, of course, the last point is that people who have strong support networks tend to be healthier and tend to live longer. There are tons of studies that have looked at this from a whole bunch of different perspectives. But it seems like if you surround yourself with a positive group of people, if you know that you have people there for you, it can improve your sort of livelihood. It makes you live longer. It makes you less prone to disease and things like that. And that's a really complex factor because that's another one of those sort of chicken versus egg situations. Are you sort of happier because you have a strong network, or do you have a strong network because you tend to be happier? And then how does that relate to health and longevity and things like that? But some interesting correlational studies. And it's almost disappointing that we don't get to spend a lot more time on this because we mentioned a couple of these very briefly, but these are some really neat pieces of research to look at. So I'm kind of curious what else is out there. All right. And so then next, we're going to delve just a little bit more into the personality side of things. And so we talked about that introversion versus extroversion as it pertained to HIV-infected individuals. But if we do that link between personality and genetic factors, we remember that there is some kind of heritability to our personality. So if we can say, okay, introversion is moderately heritable, and we have a sort of heritability or vulnerability or heritability of being vulnerable to stress, how does that work together? And so they've done a couple of really interesting studies. Sweden does very good twin studies. They have really good data, and they collect a lot of just random information that us psychologists can co-opt and use for things like this. But they found that about 32% of workplace stress can be linked to genes. So it has a very large heritability. And they did this looking at twins, so our difference between identical and fraternal twins, to see how much sort of covariance we would see of that stress. So the more closely related you are, so our identical twins, if one twin is high stress, the other is more likely to also be high stress. And this is just one study, but there's lots like this. And then sort of an interesting aside that the chapter introduced as just like a tag-on paragraph at the end was talking about the fact that stress has the ability to modify expression of genes. And so this is basically saying that not only can you have genes that might influence your predisposition to stress, but you can have stress influence your expression of genes, which again makes it really complex with that directionality question. And it makes us, again, take pause looking at some of our correlational studies, because it's not a one-way street. It might, in fact, be a little bit of back and forth. So it's a lot more complex than we might have thought. And there's some really neat work that's looked at the fact that some of these sort of stress effects on our gene expression can then be passed on to offspring. So if a parent is high stress, they might have particular things active in their cells that suppress certain genes, and they might pass on those factors into their children. So the children would be born with those genes suppressed. And so that could sort of maintain itself that way. So there's lots and lots of different factors that we can look at when it comes to genetics and personality and heritability and environmental factors and all of this. So there's lots and lots going on. But because this chapter is doing that thing where it hops between lots of topics that are only tangentially related, we then take another sharp turn and we can start talking about pain. So we went from emotion to stress to pain. So I guess we could make some connections there. But here we're actually going to consider the fact that pain tends to be very closely linked with emotion. And you might even call it an emotion of its own-ish. But we're going to start seeing that our systems that recognize pain and the emotions that go along with it are very closely intertwined. And it's actually very hard to separate pain from emotion. And we'll talk about some cool research in people who don't feel pain and how that works as well. Oh, which I actually put on this slide. Good. I always forget where I put things. But yeah, so some people have what's called a congenital insensitivity to pain. And so it's a rare genetic disorder in the peripheral nervous system where basically people don't pick up on any pain signals coming into their body. So if you think about it, when we feel pain, a lot of the times it's to let us know that we're injured. So maybe you touch something too hot on the stove and you pull back quickly. Your pain basically prevented you from hurting yourself worse than just a brief touch. But if these individuals don't sense pain, they might touch that hot thing for much longer. And so it can cause lots of problems. They might not even notice that they're injured. So a lot of people with this congenital insensitivity to pain have to do regular self-checks to make sure that they haven't accidentally scratched themselves. They're not bleeding. They haven't bit their tongue or anything like that. And so they are very prone to injury because they don't notice that things are causing them pain. And so they might push past something, even if the pain would have been a useful signal to tell them to stop a particular action. And there's actually a lot of studies that show that people with this disorder end up being a lot shorter in life expectancy because of the constant injuries and the fact that they might not know that they're ever sort of unwell. And so we're going to be talking about these individuals who are insensitive to pain a couple of times throughout these last few slides here, because they allow us to kind of pick apart which parts of our brain are involved in sensing pain, and if they're the same as reacting to pain and things like that. But first, we're going to look at some of our pathways that are involved here. And so we might have figured out that our somatosensory cortex is the primary projection area for pain. And that's that sort of strip that runs along that part of your brain at the top. And that makes sense. That's where our senses project, hence somatosensory. So it's information that's coming in from a bunch of different sensory receptors. And those sensory receptors can also tell us about pain. So that part shouldn't be a surprise, I would hope. But pain will also activate the anterior cingulate cortex, and then that in turn will connect with our limbic system. And that's going to start bringing in sort of more things than just sensation. That's where we start kind of connecting it with emotions and feelings as well. So this allows pain to end up taking on sort of unique characteristics. And so we've talked about in our limbic system that anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. And so ACC suggests an emotional aspect of pain. So that's where we're making that connection. And we have this really interesting factor where individuals who are anticipating pain, so someone who's come to expect pain following a particular situation, you'll actually see activation in the ACC as you prepare for that pain. So if you know it's coming, so maybe if we looked at, say, classical conditioning or something like that, where you know that a particular sound will be followed by some kind of discomfort, you could respond in that part of your brain before that sensation even appears, which is really, really interesting. And then we have this very neat factor where if we have sort of repetition of pain signals, as it becomes more and more unpleasant. So if something's happening, maybe you have a blister on the back of your foot, and as you walk, it starts hurting worse and worse and worse. And the sensation that's coming from the blister might not actually be that much worse. Your sensory receptors are sending the same amount of signal, but we start seeing more response in the brain, specifically in that part of the limbic system. So even though there isn't more of a intense sensation, we perceive it as getting more intense because of that sort of emotional connection. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on here where pain and our interpretation of pain almost overlap with that emotionality. And that's why we sort of spend quite a bit of time talking about it here. And then there was sort of a one-line thing mentioned in our textbook that said that, so acetaminophen might actually owe some of its pain-alleviating properties because it dampens emotion rather than the pain receptors themselves. So it's not that it directly interferes with the sensory output of feeling the pain. It's more that it stops us caring about it so much. Which is kind of cool. And I really wish that they had said more about that, but they did not. So lots of interesting topics in this chapter. And then, of course, okay, so short-term pain, we were talking about how it can be adaptive. But we also have sort of that's short-term is fine. But if we have prolonged pain, we actually start activating other parts of the brain as well. And so here we say that prolonged pain will also start recruiting parts of our prefrontal cortex. So if you remember, our prefrontal cortex is involved in making connections with information, where we start doing some of our deeper thinking and evaluating. And so this is where we would start evaluating pain and deciding what the best response would be to a painful situation. So if we're in pain for a really long time, maybe we put our hand on the stove and we had a reflex of pulling back, but we're still hurting. Our hand is still in pain. Maybe now we need to decide what's the best way to reduce this pain. What do we do next? Okay, and that's where I wanted to make that tie-in. I was going to say, because we have aggression on the next slide, and there was something else I wanted to say, but it was right here. So because we have sort of this physical experience of pain in that somatosensory cortex area, and then we have the emotional aspect of pain in our limbic system, and then we can start connecting things in our prefrontal cortex, having these things in separate parts of the brain actually links us back to those individuals with pain insensitivity disorders. And in those cases, some of them have been shown not to have diminished sensation. It's not that they're not getting as much of a sensory signal about pain. It's that they have a reduced emotional response to pain. So it's not that they don't feel the pain at all. It's that they feel it, but don't register it as important. It doesn't matter to them, and so they ignore that sensation. It gets dismissed as unimportant. And as we've talked about, when things are deemed unimportant, we don't pay attention to them. If they're not in our awareness, we don't deal with them. So it's kind of interesting that they could recognize that the situation is painful, but they don't really make that connection of they should do something about it or that it's a bad thing. And if we actually look back at individuals who underwent prefrontal lobotomies, They had people who would say that, yeah, I used to feel pain, I still feel pain, but it isn't as big. It's a much smaller pain, implying that losing that emotional connection, being able to sort of associate it with that emotional tie, ended up lessening the experience of pain. So another very interesting concept. Our next topic is to bring in the concept of aggression. So lots of potentially negative things here, but aggression is going to be forceful or assertive behavior that is intended to harm or control another. And we're actually going to talk about 4 different subcategories of aggression. And these all seem to have different sort of roots, different causes, different intentions, but also other things that are related to them. So what part of the brain is involved, what's gone wrong if we see it, those sorts of things. So we're going to start with the first 2, which are most commonly used in non-human animal literature. So we typically see talk of predatory aggression and effective aggression when looking at non-human animals. And that kind of makes sense. Predatory aggression is just aggression that occurs when an animal attacks and kills its prey, or if a human makes sort of a premeditated, unprovoked attack on the other. So going after another individual. And this is typically something that isn't overly emotional. If you think about a wolf hunting a deer for food, that's just what they do. It's not intended to be sort of mean or anything like that. It's just what they do in order to get food. So predatory aggression doesn't necessarily assume sort of a bad motive. It's just saying that it's happening and the intent